Chemistry students, how's it going? So Unit 5 here is going to be about chemical reactions. Chemical reactions, this is fun stuff. Our first target, we want to be able to write a balanced chemical equation for a reaction, but before we get to that today, let's talk a little bit about what a chemical reaction is and how you know whether or not a chemical reaction has happened, and also let's mention some things that are not chemical reactions, so we know what things are and what things aren't chemical reactions. Let's get to that. Okay, so what is a chemical reaction? A chemical reaction is what happens anytime chemical does something or chemicals do something together that causes a new substance to appear that was not there before. You've had a chemical reaction. Okay, so what does that mean? Maybe at some point you've burned a sheet of paper. That's a chemical reaction. So if you think about it, before you burned that sheet of paper, what did you have? You had paper and you had oxygen in the air. And then after you burned that paper, you had ashes, which are a new thing that wasn't there before. You didn't have ashes before. Now you have ashes, right? And also carbon dioxide in the air, which is a new thing that wasn't there before. So this is what a chemical reaction is. It produces a new thing that was not there before. Okay? When you have a chemical reaction, what goes on is the atoms inside of those things, either that one chemical or those multiple chemicals that you started with, the atoms get shuffled around, rearranged, broken apart, put together. Something happens with those atoms so that they get shaken up, rearranged, and produce a new thing that wasn't there before. That's what a chemical reaction is. Okay, how do you know when a chemical reaction has happened? Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious, right? There are a few things that can clue you in to whether or not a chemical reaction has happened. Now keep in mind, the things I'm going to mention here are clues. These things could happen and it's still not a chemical reaction. Really, the only way you know for 100% absolute sure that a chemical reaction has happened is you go into a laboratory, you analyze what you got left over, and you see if there's a new thing that wasn't there before. But there are some clues that can tell you that maybe a chemical reaction has happened here. Okay? A couple of clues. If you notice a change in color. A change in color is usually a pretty good indication a chemical reaction has happened. If you notice a change in temperature, if something gets hotter or colder, that's a pretty good indication that a chemical reaction has taken place. Or if you notice bubbles form. When you see bubbles form, usually that's a gas being produced. And a gas being produced inside of a liquid is probably a new thing that wasn't there before. Fire is a good indication that a chemical reaction has happened. If your substance begins emitting sound or light, that's a good indication that you have a chemical reaction. And finally, the formation of what's called a precipitate is a good indication of a chemical reaction. A precipitate is a solid substance that forms when you mix liquids together. So I know you guys have probably seen it in the lab before. You might not have realized it was a solid substance. Sometimes you mix two things together and it'll make like a powdery substance inside of the liquid. And if you let that sit for a while, the powdery substance will kind of settle down to the bottom. It's a solid formed from two liquids there. So those are some clues that a chemical reaction has taken place. Okay, so you should be able to look for a few of those clues and decide whether or not a chemical reaction has probably happened. You can't say for sure, but you should be able to say, did it probably happen or not? Now, there are a few things sometimes people mistake for chemical reactions that are actually not chemical reactions. So real quick here, let's talk about a few things that are not chemical reactions. First one, a phase change. A phase change is when something goes between solid, liquid, or gas, right? So if you have an ice cube that melts, if you have water that freezes, if you have something boils or condenses into a liquid, if you go between solid, liquid, gas, that's a phase change. And when you have a phase change, you don't have a new substance. You might say, well, Mr. McQuinn, when water freezes, then you have ice. That's a new thing. But ice is not a different substance than water. They're the same substance. They're both H2O, right? So you don't get a new substance. A phase change is not a chemical reaction. Also not a chemical reaction is a dissolving. You have some salt and some water, and you probably know if I put the salt in the water, it's going to dissolve in the water, right? Dissolving is not a chemical reaction. Also not a chemical reaction, breaking something. Not a chemical reaction. Okay, the last example of a not a chemical reaction I'm going to talk about here is a nuclear reaction. And sometimes this one is confusing. We'll talk about nuclear reactions towards the end of class, but sometimes it's confusing. A nuclear reaction, you actually do get a new substance that wasn't there before, but it's not a chemical reaction. Because in a nuclear reaction, that new substance results from changes in the nucleus of an atom rather than rearrangement of atoms. So a nuclear reaction is not a chemical reaction. All right, so I'm going to ask you to look at some situations and say whether or not a chemical reaction probably happened there. Since you're looking for clues, you can't say for sure. So say whether or not it probably happened. And here's a couple of examples. Let's talk about a couple of examples. The first one, it says salt dissolves in water. Did a chemical reaction probably take place or not? Hopefully you say, no, it did not. Because we just talked about dissolving is not a chemical reaction. And when something dissolves in water, you don't get a new substance that wasn't there before. You still got salt, you've still got water, right? So that is not a chemical reaction. What about an ice cube melts in the sun and then later on the water evaporates? Do you have a chemical reaction? Hopefully you said no, you do not, because these are just phase changes. And that's one of the things we talked about that's not a chemical reaction. So when the ice cube melts and then evaporates, at the beginning you had water, frozen water, and at the end you had water, which was a gas. So, I mean, you still just have water. There's no new substance. So that one is not a chemical reaction. And finally, the third example here, an old silver spoon tarnishes. Sometimes people don't know what the word tarnish means. Tarnish means like it rusts, sort of. Okay, so an old silver spoon tarnishes. Is that a chemical reaction? Hopefully it says, yes it is, right? What did you start with there? You started with silver. A silver spoon is made out of silver, and then when it tarnishes, you get, I don't know if you've seen a tarnished silver spoon, it gets this black stuff on it. Now you have a new substance, wasn't there before, that black stuff, right? So that is a chemical reaction. All right, so there's some things that are chemical reactions, some clues that you have a chemical reaction, some things that are not chemical reactions. Hopefully that gets us a step closer to being able to write balanced chemical equations. I know it doesn't seem like it yet, but now that we know what a chemical reaction is, we'll go on next time and we'll talk about chemical equations. So until then, we'll see you then.